"You will never touch that piano again, Eli. Not while I'm in charge." That one sentence nearly silenced a prodigy. But when a cruel headmaster tried to smother a poor boy's gift, a janitor pressed record, and the governor of the state heard what the world almost missed. From hidden halls to viral fame, from expulsion threats to standing ovations, cruel headmaster denied boy's piano request. Then the governor heard him play and intervened. Is a sweeping emotional saga of injustice, resistance, and the redemptive power of truth and talent. One boy's music lit a movement, and it all began with a locked piano and a whisper in the dark. Now, before we dive deeper, please like and subscribe to our channel. We share powerful, meaningful stories like this every day. And drop a comment below to let us know what time and where you're watching from. Thank you so much, and now, let's get back to the story. You will never touch that piano again, Eli. Not while I'm in charge. The finality in Headmaster Cray's voice was like a hammer cracking against Eli's ribs. His words, cold and sharp as winter glass, echoed through the cavernous stone hallway of St. Bartholomew's Academy. Eli's eyes stung, but he refused to blink. He wouldn't let Cray see the tears pushing at the corners. "But sir, Eli's voice broke like a twig underfoot. "I just wanted to." Cray raised a pale hand, silencing the boy as if flicking off a nuisance. His eyes were slate gray, void of warmth. "Music is a privilege. Privileges are earned. You've earned nothing." The door to the music hall slammed behind him, the sound final, absolute. Eli stood motionless, fists clenched at his sides, heart thudding with a mix of rage and helplessness. St. Bartholomew's was a place built on discipline, its legacy forged in the strict tradition of Old England, though the school sat tucked away in a sleepy Southern American town. Ornate, ivy-covered stone walls surrounded the campus, but the beauty outside hid a rigid, soulless core. For boys like Eli, boys without legacy, without money, without voices, it was a cage with polished floors and locked doors. Eli was 12. Thin, sharp-featured, always looking older than his years because life had never allowed him the luxury of being young. He had come to the school on scholarship after his mother died. His father had vanished long ago, a whisper in the wind. All he had now were memories and the aching, unspoken melodies that lived inside his hands. He first found the music room by accident. It was an old wing, barely used, shadowed with forgotten sunlight and draped in sheets and dust. The grand piano stood in the center like a sleeping beast. Black lacquer chipped at the edges, ivory keys dulled but intact. It called to him like something out of a dream. He would slip in after hours when the halls hushed and the world turned away. And he played. At first fumbling, uncertain, then with growing confidence as the weeks passed. He had no sheet music, no teacher, only the fragmented memories of his mother humming lullabies while folding laundry or stirring soup. His fingers learned to tell stories she never got to finish. Mrs. Tilda, the janitor, found him once. He expected her to yell, to drag him out by the collar. But instead she sat quietly in the back, hands folded over a mop handle, and whispered afterward, "Don't let anyone steal what's inside you, boy. Play." It became their secret. She'd leave the door ajar, turn a blind eye, and once even brought him an old, worn music book with frayed edges and penciled-in notes. She didn't say where it came from, but that night, it changed everything. Eli had stayed too long. He'd gotten lost in a composition of his own invention, a delicate swirl of sorrow and hope. He didn't hear Cray's footsteps, didn't notice the door open. Only when the final note died and the air turned cold did he feel the presence behind him. The fury in Cray's eyes was almost too large to fit in the room. "You ungrateful little trespasser," he seethed. "You think rules don't apply to you because you can twinkle your fingers on some keys?" The next morning, Cray summoned him to his office. Oak-paneled, shadow-heavy, the room felt like judgment itself. Cray's voice was controlled, low. "You're not here to indulge in delusions of grandeur. You're here to be shaped into a useful citizen. Piano playing? That's for gentlemen. You're a charity case, and don't you forget it." He barred Eli from the music hall, locked the door, warned that any further disobedience would result in immediate expulsion. Eli walked back to his dorm under a sky swollen with storm. The rain began softly, like tears falling from reluctant clouds. He didn't run. He let it soak him. Because if he ran, he might scream. If he screamed, he might shatter. That night, Mrs. Tilda brought him a mug of warm milk, and sat beside him in the hallway. "I've cleaned these halls 30 years, she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Seen boys come and go, but I ain't never seen fingers like yours. That music you made, it's not just playing, Eli, it's speaking, screaming for the world to hear." He didn't respond, just stared at the milk as steam curled upward like silent prayers. "You keep playing," she whispered. "Even if it's in your dreams, you don't let that man close your soul." But Eli didn't sneak into the music room after that. The risk was too great. He couldn't afford to be expelled. Not with nowhere to go. Not with nothing and no one waiting for him outside those iron gates. Instead, he played in his mind, on his desk, on the cold windowsill at night. He tapped melodies into the air while other boys slept. He hummed softly beneath his breath during chapel. His music became a ghost that followed him, haunting every quiet moment. And one day, while sweeping the hallway near the locked music room, Mrs. Tilda did something different. She brought an old cassette recorder from her closet, sat it quietly on the bench beside the piano. She gave Eli a look, not a command but an invitation. He stared at her wide-eyed and whispered, "If he finds out, let him find out." Sometimes the only way to stop fear is to face it with something louder. That night, while the school slept under a heavy moon, Eli played again. The door was still locked, but Mrs. Tilda had keys. The room was cold, but his hands were warm with purpose. The notes poured out of him like rainfall on thirsty earth, and Mrs. Tilda pressed the record button. That recording would travel far, farther than either of them could imagine. But for now, it was just a secret between an old janitor and a boy who played like his life depended on it. Because in truth, it did. The first note fell like a breath, a trembling whisper stretched across silence. Mrs. Tilda sat in the far corner of the music room, her arms folded tightly against her chest, breath caught in her throat. The dim moonlight spilled in through the stained glass windows, painting Eli in soft blue and amber. He sat at the piano, back straight, fingers poised like a diver at the edge of a cliff. Then he jumped. The music began with uncertainty, like a child walking barefoot on frost. But within seconds it unfolded into something deeper, heart-wrenching, intricate, tender. Every note carried the weight of unsaid things: the death of his mother, the echo of an absent father, the silent cruelty of a school that saw him as less than human. The piano didn't just make sound, it spoke, wept, screamed, prayed. Tilda's hand, aged and knotted from decades of work, trembled slightly as she adjusted the recorder. She didn't know if anyone would listen, but she knew someone needed to. As Eli played, his eyes closed and his body moved not with showmanship but with surrender. He was giving himself away with every note, unlocking the prison inside him. For those minutes, he wasn't a forgotten boy in a hostile school. He was a composer, a storm, a symphony. When he finished, the silence afterward was holy. Tilda wiped at her cheek and said nothing. Neither did he. There was nothing to say. She stopped the tape, placed the recorder back in her coat pocket, and offered only a small nod before disappearing into the shadows. He didn't see her shoulders shaking as she walked. She stayed up that night, pressing rewind and play over and over. The tape hissed softly each time like an exhale before Eli's music returned. She didn't sleep. By morning, she made a choice. Her niece, Melinda, taught music at a small community center downtown. Melinda had a gift for recognizing talent in the raw and broken, and though Tilda rarely asked for favors, this time she did. She handed her the recorder during Sunday dinner, saying only, "It's a boy from my school. Listen when you can." Melinda didn't wait. She listened that night, and by the second track she was crying. The next morning, she called Tilda. "This child," she whispered, "he's not just good. He's extraordinary." Melinda uploaded the audio to her social media with a simple caption: "Untrained. 12 years old, playing from memory. You have to hear this." No name, no details, just the music. At first the post was lost in the noise, just another drop in the digital sea. A few likes, a couple of shares. But then someone reposted it, then another. A teacher in Atlanta, a pianist in Chicago, a composer in New York. By the end of the week, it had quietly gathered thousands of plays. Comments flooded in, people asking who the child was, where they could hear more, if he was okay. There was something about the sound. It felt urgent, aching, real. It wasn't polished, but it was alive. Alive in a way most music wasn't. Back at St. Bartholomew's, Eli had no idea. He still walked the halls in silence, still tapped melodies into his pillow at night. The piano room remained locked. Cray's warning echoed in his dreams. But Tilda watched the numbers rise with cautious hope. She didn't tell Eli yet. She didn't want to give him dreams that might burn away too fast. Instead, she waited for something solid, something that could protect him. And it came, in the form of an email. Melinda forwarded it to Tilda with trembling hands. It was from someone in the governor's office, a man named Victor Lang, special aide to Governor Alden Reese. It was short and direct. Governor Reese heard the piano recording. He's asked to know who the boy is. Please contact us. Tilda read it 3 times before she moved. Her heart thundered as she printed the message and tucked it into her coat. She didn't go to Cray. Not yet. She went to Eli first. He was in the library as always, seated alone at a far table, eyes flickering over a math textbook that may as well have been written in code. When she sat across from him, he looked up with the wary eyes of someone who had learned to expect bad news. Tilda reached into her pocket and slid the paper across the table. "What's this?" he asked, voice tight. "Just read it." He read, his eyes widened, then his brow furrowed in disbelief. Is this real?" "It is." Her voice was gentle but firm. "He heard you play, Eli, the governor." He sat back in his chair, blinking fast, mouth slightly open. For a moment he looked like a child again, small, stunned, and aching to believe. "But how? I recorded you," she said quietly. "That night, remember? I sent it to someone. She shared it. And now, the right ears heard it." He didn't speak for a long time, just stared at the paper, jaw clenched as if afraid it might vanish. Finally, he whispered, "What do I do?" Tilda reached across the table and took his hand. "You keep playing, Eli. And when the world asks to listen, you let them." But St. Bartholomew's was still a place of rules, and Cray's grip was far from loosened. They couldn't tell him. Not yet. If he found out Eli's music was out in the world, he might destroy everything. So they planned quietly. Melinda would write back. They would arrange for the governor to visit in secret under the guise of a school inspection. He wanted to hear the boy in person. And until then, Eli would prepare. In shadows, in whispers, in silent notes tapped on cold windowsills. Because even in silence, his music was waiting. It always had been. It began with a summons, slipped under Eli's dormitory door in the early hours before light touched the frost-lined windows. "Report to Headmaster Cray's office." Immediately. No greeting, no explanation. Just the kind of message that made your breath turn to stone. Eli dressed in silence, every movement tight with dread. He knew the rhythm of the school's punishment, the slow crescendo of intimidation before the sharp public humiliation. He walked the length of the corridor as if walking toward a noose. Cray was already seated behind his massive oak desk when Eli entered. He didn't look up at first, just signed something with sharp strokes of his pen. The room smelled of leather and varnish, and fear. Finally, Cray spoke. "Do you know what happens to boys who steal?" Eli didn't answer. "Boys who lie?" Cray continued, his voice oily and slow, "who defy authority and think they can make a mockery of this institution." Still, Eli stood mute. Cray looked up then, and his smile was not a smile at all. "I told you, didn't I? Never touch that piano again." "I haven't," Eli whispered. "Liar." Cray flung a manila envelope across the desk. It skidded and stopped in front of Eli. Inside, blurry photographs taken through the cracked window of the music hall. Eli, at the piano, lit by moonlight. "I know everything," Cray hissed. "Do you think these walls don't talk? Do you think there aren't eyes everywhere?" He stood, coming around the desk, towering over the boy. "You broke the rules. You were warned. And now," Eli's voice came, a threadbare whisper, "I didn't mean harm. Intent is irrelevant. Order matters. And this?" He slammed his palm on the folder. "This is disorder. Chaos. You think music will save you? It won't." Cray turned his back, walked to the window, spoke with a cruel stillness. "You'll be on a train by week's end, expelled, your scholarship revoked." Eli froze. The word struck harder than any slap could. Expelled. Where would he go? He had no family, no home. This school was cold and cruel, but it was a roof, a bed, food. Without it, he was nothing more than a ghost child on the streets. "You can't," he started, but Cray turned sharply. "I can, and I will. Unless," he leaned close, his voice dropping lower, "unless you sign a confession, a letter admitting guilt, promise to never touch the piano again, not here, not anywhere. Stay out of sight. Stay obedient. You'll remain. Eli stared at him, trembling. You want me to lie? I want you to fall in line. Eli didn't respond. Not then. Just nodded, barely, and turned to leave. But as he walked back to his room, every step was heavier than the last. It wasn't just about the piano anymore. It was about who he was allowed to be. Tilda found him that evening. He sat beneath the gnarled oak behind the chapel, staring at the ground like he could disappear into it. What happened? She asked gently. He told her everything. By the end, she was pale, fists clenched at her sides. He's not just trying to silence you, she said. He's trying to erase you. Eli nodded. He wants me to sign a lie. And will you? He didn't answer for a long time. The breeze rustled the leaves above them, carrying with it the faintest hint of music, an echo, a memory. Finally, he said, I don't know. But someone else had heard the threat. Mrs. Tilda wasn't alone when Eli confessed. Another staff member, a young English teacher named Miss Rowan, had followed her, concerned by the boy's absence in class. She stood just beyond the chapel wall, out of sight, listening. The next morning, she went to the faculty lounge and whispered the story to a few trusted colleagues. They were tired of Cray, tired of the fear. Eli's story became a spark, and in quiet corners of the school, that spark found kindling. Teachers began to speak. One had seen Cray tear up a student's art portfolio, calling it degenerate nonsense. Another had overheard Cray telling a boy from the foster system that orphans never become anything worth remembering. And always, he wielded expulsion like a blade. Now faced with Eli's quiet brilliance, with proof of something extraordinary, the staff whispered rebellion. And Mrs. Tilda sent one final message. To Melinda. To Victor Lang. 3 words. He's threatening Eli. The response came fast. Victor called Tilda directly. The governor is no longer waiting. He's coming. 2 days. Tilda's hands shook as she hung up the phone. The tide was turning. But Cray didn't know yet. He walked the halls still, smug and blind, unaware that his grip was slipping. And Eli, though afraid, made a decision. He would not sign the letter. Because the piano wasn't just sound. It was the truth. And sometimes telling the truth was the most dangerous thing you could do. The sunlight filtered through stained glass windows like a fractured promise the morning Eli chose not to sign the letter. Cray was waiting in his office, ink pen poised, a smug grin ghosting his lips. Well? Eli stood in silence. His shoulders, though narrow, did not bend. I won't lie, he said. I won't stop playing. The smile vanished. Cray's pen clattered against the desk. You insolent little. He stood so fast the chair toppled backward. You're done here? Finished? Eli didn't flinch. He turned slowly and walked out. For the first time, he wasn't afraid. Because far from the looming shadow of the school's cold heart, something small and bright was catching fire. Melinda had sent the tape not just to friends, but to a contact at a local arts nonprofit. They posted a short clip of Eli's playing on their official page, along with the caption, Listen to the soul of a boy who was told he doesn't belong at the piano. The clip struck deep. It wasn't a flashy performance. It was raw, honest. A pair of 2 small hands pressing against keys like they were begging them to listen. The internet, jaded though it was, paused. Shares turned into articles. Blogs picked up the story. Unknown piano prodigy plays through pain. Who was the boy in the recording? Victor Lang watched it unfold with clinical urgency. Then Governor Alden Reese watched and didn't speak for a full 5 minutes after it ended. This child, Reese finally murmured, is the reason we still fight for public schools, for art, for justice. He made a call. We're going to the school. I want to hear him myself. Back at St. Bartholomew's, the tide was rising, quietly. Miss Rowan met Mrs. Tilda after classes in the supply closet, their voices hushed. You think the governor will actually come? He's not just coming, Tilda said. He's coming with cameras. Rowan exhaled shakily. Cray doesn't know? No, but he will, and soon. Still, the school was a battlefield. Cray doubled down. He posted a new decree on the student board. No music is to be played or practiced without explicit permission. Offenders will be suspended immediately. He patrolled the halls like a warden, flanked by sycophantic senior prefects, eyes peeled for any trace of rebellion. The piano room remained locked, bolted with a new chain. But Eli had become more than one boy with a gift. He was a symbol. And symbols, when threatened, tend to awaken something in others. It began with the upperclassman who slipped a folded piece of sheet music into Eli's math book. Then another boy, a quiet cello player, who walked by and whispered, "Keep going." Notes began to appear in Eli's locker, drawings of pianos, quotes about courage, no names, just signatures, anonymous but listening. The night before the governor's visit, Eli couldn't sleep. He lay on his back staring at the cracks in the ceiling, hands moving over his blanket in silent patterns. Tilda came at midnight. Her eyes were fierce. "Come." He followed her through the dark halls, past locked classrooms and still portraits of men who'd built the school, stern-faced and judgmental. She led him not to the piano room, but to the old chapel. And there, in the center beneath the vaulted ceiling and faded stars, stood a small upright piano. Dusty, out of tune, but waiting. "I had it moved here when Cray chained the other one," she said. "It's not much, but it's yours tonight." Eli sat, touched a key, and flinched at the slightly sour note. "It's perfect," he whispered. And he played. No cameras, no audience, just him and her. The spark that had smoldered in secret now burned freely, quietly illuminating the edges of his spirit. Every note he played was a refusal to disappear. Every pause a declaration that he still existed. That night he played until his fingers ached and the stars outside faded into dawn. The governor would arrive in hours, and so would the reckoning. The black town car rolled past the wrought iron gates of St. Bartholomew's just after noon, a subtle but seismic tremor beneath the school's carefully ordered exterior. The flags fluttered at half-mast for a civic memorial, but their timing gave the impression of reverence. Cray stood on the front steps with two prefects flanking him like polished statues. His posture was impeccable, his smile brittle. When Governor Alden Reese stepped out of the vehicle, Cray extended his hand. "Governor Reese, an honor." The governor didn't shake it. He simply nodded once, coolly. "Thank you for accommodating this unscheduled visit, Headmaster Cray. We're touring educational institutions as part of our new arts initiative." Cray's smile faltered for the briefest second. "Of course, we have nothing to hide." Victor Lang stepped out behind the governor, clipboard in hand, scanning the school's stone facade like it was a crime scene. Tilda watched from the shadows beneath the archway, heart pounding. Beside her, Miss Rowan gave a single, silent nod. It was time. Inside, the atmosphere shifted. Teachers stood a little straighter. Students exchanged glances of curiosity and hushed excitement. Rumors ran like wildfire. "The governor's here? A performance? A scandal? Eli?" Cray led the governor through the manicured halls, pointing out plaques and oil portraits, boasting of alumni turned senators and CEOs. Reese nodded, mostly silent, until they passed the locked music hall. "What's behind this door?" he asked casually. Cray stiffened. "That wing is no longer in active use. We've repurposed most of our music curriculum. The arts are important, of course, but—" "You've discontinued the music program?" Reese cut in, arching an eyebrow. "It's not cost-effective. We favor STEM disciplines." Reese turned to Victor Lang. "Note that. We'll want a breakdown of state-funded arts allocation here." Cray's face flushed, but he recovered quickly. "Shall I show you the computer labs instead?" "Actually," Reese said, "I'd like to meet one of your students." Cray blinked. "Any particular one?" Reese paused, his voice even. "The pianist." Silence thickened like smoke. "I'm not sure I understand," Cray said, his voice pinched. Victor Lang stepped forward. "A recording was circulated recently, an unnamed student at this school playing piano. The governor was deeply moved. We'd like to hear him perform." Cray's face tightened like a drawn bow. "I'm afraid no such recording came through the proper channels. If there has been a breach—" "No breach," Reese said. "Just brilliance." Cray fumbled. "I can assure you, Governor, the student in question is under review for multiple violations. It would be inappropriate to—" "Headmaster," Reese interrupted. "Where is he?" Cray hesitated a beat too long, and then the side door opened. Eli stepped into the corridor. He wore his plain uniform, collar askew, shoes scuffed. His hands twitched at his sides, eyes darting between the governor and Cray. Victor Lang smiled softly. "Eli, is it?" Eli nodded, heart hammering so hard he thought it might fracture. "We'd like to hear you play." Cray moved to speak, but the governor raised a hand, silencing him. Eli stammered. "The piano room is locked." Tilda appeared then, from the hallway beyond. "There's a piano in the chapel, if the governor doesn't mind walking a little." Reese looked at Eli. "Lead the way." They walked in silence, the group trailing behind the small boy with the world's weight on his shoulders. Cray followed at a clipped pace, jaw tight, eyes flashing. Inside the chapel, dust hung like memory. The upright piano waited, humble and imperfect. Eli sat. The room was still. His fingers hovered, hesitated, then found the keys. The first notes came hesitant, as if unsure they were welcome. But with each bar, confidence bloomed. He played not for approval or survival, but for something higher, something holy. The room disappeared. Time vanished. Eli became the music. He played the ache of his mother's absence, the terror of silence, the glow of small kindnesses. He played defiance and longing and hope, all stitched into melody. When he finished, the air felt shattered. The governor's eyes glistened. He stood very still. Then slowly, he began to clap. Not polite applause, real, resounding claps that echoed like justice through stone and stained glass. Tilda clapped too. Then Miss Rowan. Then the teachers who had crept in quietly, and even students peeking through the back pews. A wave of sound rose like a flood. Cray did not clap. He simply turned, jaw clenched, and walked out. Victor approached Eli with tears at the corners of his eyes. "You have a gift, son, and gifts like this? They belong to the world." Eli looked up, dazed. The governor crouched beside him. "How would you feel about a scholarship, Eli? To a school where the piano is always unlocked?" Eli blinked. Once, twice, then finally he smiled. A real smile. The climb had begun. You said, the silence that followed the governor's departure was not peace. It was the silence of a predator recoiling before a final strike. Cray did not sleep that night. He paced the length of his office, jaw rigid, breath sharp. Outside, the chapel's stained glass caught the moonlight in a kaleidoscope of color. Mocking him, he thought. The governor's applause still rang in his ears, a chorus of betrayal, not just by Reese, but by his staff, by his students, by a boy. That boy. Cray hadn't risen through the ranks of academia on kindness. He knew how to wield power, with precision, with fear. And now, with a storm gathering around him, he reverted to instinct. At dawn, he called an emergency disciplinary council. 3 board members, all hand-picked years ago. He laid out a fabricated report: insubordination, defiance, unauthorized use of school property, dishonesty. He called for Eli's immediate expulsion. But something had changed in the school. Word of Eli's performance had spread not just through whispers, but in the very air. Students carried it in their posture, in the hopeful looks they exchanged. Teachers walked with quiet pride, no longer hollow-eyed, and some, finally, spoke up. Miss Rowan burst into the council room mid-session, trembling but unyielding. "This isn't discipline," she said. "It's persecution." Cray narrowed his eyes. "You are out of line." "No," she snapped. "You are. And we're done watching you tear this school apart." One board member, a quiet man with round glasses, cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should hear from the boy." Cray exploded. "He's a child. A liar, eh?" "He's a student," the man said firmly. "One whose talent brought the governor here. We owe him that." Eli was brought in under escort. His eyes scanned the room and settled on Rowan. Her presence steadied him. "Eli," one board member asked gently, "did you break into the music hall?" "I didn't break in," Eli said, voice calm. "I was let in. By Mrs. Tilda." Gasps fluttered through the room. Cray turned crimson. Tilda stood in the doorway, unflinching. "I opened that door because locking it was wrong." Cray stood, trembling with fury. "You've overstepped your place, woman." "I know exactly where my place is," she replied. "Right beside the child you tried to silence." More staff had arrived, quietly gathering, lining the back of the room. Not just Miss Rowan and Tilda, but others. Mr. Havers, the history teacher, Coach Dewey, even the groundskeeper, still in boots and dirt. And then, unexpectedly, the chapel doors opened again. Victor Lang entered. He didn't need to speak. His presence alone shifted the ground. "I have a message from Governor Reese," he said, voice like steel. "He's requesting an inquiry into administrative practices at St. Bartholomew's, effective immediately." Cray blanched. Victor turned to the board. "You'll find the governor's formal statement in your inboxes. He was deeply disturbed by what he witnessed here, not the boy's talent, but the headmaster's response to it." He turned back to Eli, softer now. "You've started something, Eli. A wave, and waves wash away what no longer belongs." That afternoon, Cray was escorted from his office, not in handcuffs, but with the same finality. His nameplate was removed, his portrait in the Great Hall quietly taken down the next day. Eli, for the first time, walked freely across the quad without eyes trailing him in contempt. Now they watched with wonder, respect, even awe. And on the chapel piano, now unchained, someone had placed a note. "Play again tonight. We'll be listening." The tide had turned. But Eli knew it wasn't the end. It was the beginning of everything. The air was different that morning, electric and reverent, like the hush before a thunderstorm. Even the birds outside the ivy-clad walls of St. Bartholomew's seemed to pause mid-song, sensing something monumental was drawing near. Word had already spread through the campus like wildfire. The governor was returning, not in secrecy this time, not in disguise or under the pretense of a surprise inspection. No, this was official, deliberate, and irreversible. Eli stood at the edge of the chapel steps, his hands tucked into the sleeves of his too-short uniform coat. His fingers, always restless, moved as if remembering keys even in the cold morning air. He looked out over the courtyard where students clustered in tight groups, murmuring, pointing. Some nodded to him now, offering small smiles, tentative but real. It was the first time he'd felt like anything more than a shadow. Beside him stood Mrs. Tilda, unflinching as ever, and Miss Rowan, her face pale but set with purpose. Behind them were the teachers who had dared to step forward. Mr. Havers with his battered briefcase, Coach Dewey with chalk still on his sleeves. They were a small army of defiance. And then the motorcade arrived. The governor's black SUV came to a slow halt in front of the school, its flags fluttering like heralds of change. Doors opened. First, Victor Lang stepped out, crisp and purposeful, scanning the faces like a conductor reading a score. Then came Governor Alden Reese, tall, silver-haired, with eyes sharp enough to slice through lies. He looked directly at Eli. "Hello again," he said. Eli swallowed hard and nodded. "Hello, sir." Reese approached with a warmth that caught Eli off guard. He extended his hand, not in formality, but as a human gesture. "You ready?" the governor asked gently. Eli hesitated, then grasped his hand. His voice trembled. "I think so." Reese turned to the crowd. "I've come to hear a young man play," he said, his voice carrying not with volume but with quiet authority. "And to make something right." The crowd parted as they entered the chapel together. This time, the piano wasn't hidden in a corner or dust-covered. It stood at the center, newly tuned, polished until it gleamed. A small sign sat atop it, "Donated in honor of bravery and truth." Eli took his seat on the bench. The silence that fell was total. Breathless, he touched the keys. Familiar, alive. The first note rang out and the world seemed to hold its breath. He didn't play a practiced piece. He didn't even fully understand what he was doing. He just let go. His fingers danced and trembled, telling a story too large for words. It was sorrow and fire. It was his mother humming in the kitchen. It was the echo of locked doors, and the taste of fear, and the burst of sunlight in the governor's eyes. He played like the chapel itself had become lungs, and he was its breath. And when he finished, there were tears on faces that hadn't cried in years. Victor Lang wiped his eyes. Mrs. Tilda clapped, slowly at first, then stronger. Soon the whole room echoed with applause, raucous, pure, unstoppable. Governor Reese rose to speak. "I've been to conservatories. I've heard symphonies in Paris, jazz in Harlem. But what I heard today," he paused, hand on Eli's shoulder, "was something holy. This young man has a gift that cannot, will not be silenced." He turned to the faculty. "Eli is being awarded a full scholarship to the Conservatory of New England, effective immediately. State-funded. He will also be featured in our arts initiative as a symbol of why we fight for music in education." More applause. But then Reese looked over the crowd and added, his tone suddenly harder, "And let this also stand as a warning. Any institution that buries genius under rules, that values obedience over soul, will answer to us. To the people. To the truth." The chapel thundered. And as the crowd spilled outside, reporters clicking photos and students buzzing with awe, Eli stayed seated at the piano, his fingers resting lightly on the keys. He had played for freedom. And freedom had answered. The conservatory lights shimmered like golden stars above a sea of expectant faces. Eli stood just beyond the velvet curtain, his hands trembling, heart galloping inside his chest like a wild stallion refusing to be tamed. This wasn't the dusty chapel anymore. This was the city, Cambridge, the Conservatory of New England. Every seat filled with critics, composers, professors, patrons, Somewhere in the front row sat Governor Alden Reese, back straight, hands folded, watching. And just behind him, Mrs. Tilda. Eli caught sight of her across the curtain's edge, and something inside him stilled. He'd made it. But it didn't feel like triumph yet. It felt like standing on the edge of a great drop, the world waiting to see if he would fly or fall. A stage manager gave him a subtle nod. His cue. He stepped into the light. Applause rose, polite and reserved. These people didn't know him. Not really. They'd heard whispers, read headlines. Orphan boy, piano prodigy, the governor's muse. But none of them had sat beside him when his hands bled from playing frozen keys. None had heard the way silence used to choke him at night. He bowed, took his seat, adjusted the bench. His fingers hovered, and then he began. The first movement was his own composition, untitled, unfinished, and unapologetically raw. It opened with hesitation, like a question. A single note, drawn out and yearning, followed by another and another, a slow unraveling of the tightly bound threads in his chest. The audience leaned in. He closed his eyes and let it all out. The time he stood outside the locked music hall, forehead pressed against the cold door. The weight of Cray's threat ringing in his ears. The night he played in the dark and Tilda hit record. The way his mother used to stroke his hair and hum lullabies before the cancer took her. He wove it all into melody. Pain, love, loss, defiance. He transitioned into Chopin, soft, fluid, a balm after the storm, and then pivoted into jazz, surprising everyone with a playful flourish that teased laughter from the crowd. By the final chord, silence fell. Not the empty kind, the sacred kind, the kind that followed revelation. He lifted his hands from the keys, and for a moment, just a moment, the world didn't breathe. Then came the applause. It began like a wave breaking, sudden, powerful, endless. The crowd stood, clapping, cheering. Some shouted, some cried. Even the critics dropped their pens to applaud. Governor Reese rose with the rest, his face wet with quiet tears. He didn't say a word, but his eyes met Eli's, and the pride in them nearly undid him. Tilda wiped her cheeks with a handkerchief that looked older than Eli himself. She clapped until her hands were red. The conservatory's dean stepped onto the stage. "We've hosted many performers," he said, voice amplified through the hall. "But rarely have we witnessed something like this. Young man, you haven't just played tonight. You've reminded us why we listen." He turned to the audience. "Eli Matthews will be joining our gifted program full-time, effective immediately, fully funded." Thunderous applause again. Eli sat frozen. It didn't feel real, but it was. The darkness he'd crawled through, the silence he'd once accepted, it had all led to this light. After the performance, as guests flooded the reception room with praise and handshakes, Eli found a quiet corner. He needed air. Tilda found him there, just outside in the garden, beneath a tree heavy with spring blossoms. "You were more than I imagined," she said, her voice cracking with warmth. Eli smiled. "You believed before anyone." "I didn't have to believe," she whispered. "I just had to listen." He leaned into her hug, small and shaking. "They heard me, Tilda," he murmured. She pulled back and touched his cheek. "Yes, they did, and they'll never forget." The summons came quietly but spread like thunder through the town. Board of Education hearings. Allegations against St. Bartholomew's former headmaster. The courtroom wasn't grand, just a modest municipal chamber with linoleum floors and flickering fluorescent lights. But for those seated inside, it might as well have been the center of the world. Cray sat alone at the defense table. Gone were his tailored suits, his polished shoes. He looked smaller now. Gray had crept into his hair. His hands fidgeted with a paperclip as though he could twist it back into time. At the far end of the chamber sat Mrs. Tilda, spine straight, eyes forward. Next to her, Miss Rowan, her blouse crisp, her hands calm in her lap. They had waited months for this, and beside them sat Eli. Dressed in a modest gray sweater, he watched with a quiet intensity. He hadn't come for revenge. He had come for the truth. The board called witnesses. Faculty spoke. Former students too. One by one they stepped into the light and told what they remembered. Humiliation, suppression, punishments that crossed lines. "I was told to burn my poetry notebook," one girl said. "He said it was emotional pollution." "He made me do drills outside in the rain until I fainted," said a boy, now taller, older. "All because I missed a day of church." He said Eli wasn't a musician. Rowan stated, "He said he was a mouth to feed, that he'd never amount to anything." Eli's name surfaced again and again. not with pity, but reverence. He had become the thread stitching their buried truths together. Cray tried to defend himself, his voice cracked with age and wear. I only did what was necessary. Discipline builds men. It was my duty to protect order. Order, the board chairman replied quietly, is no justification for cruelty. Finally, Eli was called. He walked slowly to the front, took the oath, sat. The room hushed. I don't want to talk about what he took from me, Eli said softly. I want to talk about what was saved. He looked at Tilda. Because someone listened, I got to keep the one part of me I thought I had to bury. He turned toward the board. I still remember the first time I touched a piano key. I didn't know what I was doing, but it felt like breathing. Like someone had unzipped the sky and let me step through. He paused. That was almost taken away. Not just the piano, but the belief that I had anything to give. He stood. If this is about justice, it's not about punishing him. It's about protecting the next child who doesn't fit the mold. Silence fell again, and then the verdict. The board found Cray guilty of gross misconduct and psychological abuse. He would be stripped of all credentials. His legacy, once gilded in arrogance, would be expunged from the institution's public records. Eli didn't cheer, he simply exhaled. Afterward, in the dim light of the setting sun, the three of them walked together, Tilda, Rowan, and Eli, beneath the cherry trees near the river. Their reflections swayed in the water like survivors of a long storm. You were brave today, Rowan said. Eli shrugged, eyes distant. I was just honest. Tilda chuckled. Sometimes that's the hardest kind of brave. A few days later, a small letter arrived for Eli. No return address. Inside, a note written in a trembling, familiar hand. I was wrong. I see that now. I hope you can do what I never did. Forgive yourself. Cray Ely folded the letter slowly. He didn't know if forgiveness would come, but the boy who once begged for permission to touch a piano no longer needed permission for anything. He had earned the truth, and he had made it sing. 10 years passed, and time, like music, moved in variations, some soft and slow, some bright and loud. Seasons spun by in cycles of falling leaves and blooming hope. The world changed, and so did Eli. He returned to St. Bartholomew's on a spring morning, not as a student, not even as a boy, but as something else entirely. A man now, tall, graceful, the edges of his face refined by time, but still soft with memory. His name no longer whispered through the halls, but echoed through concert venues, conservatories, and recording studios. But it wasn't fame that brought him back. It was gratitude. A banner stretched across the school's iron gates. Welcome home, Eli Matthews. Students stood clustered along the steps in uniforms brighter than he remembered. Teachers, new and old, watched with anticipation. And there, near the chapel, a plaque glinted under the sun. Eli walked toward it slowly. In honor of Mrs. Tilda Lawson, who chose to listen. His breath caught. The plaque was affixed to a pedestal beside a gleaming baby grand piano, shaded by a flowering dogwood tree. The piano's keys glistened, untouched yet inviting. A small boy approached him, 9 or 10, with curious eyes and hands too large for his sleeves. Are you really him? The boy asked. Eli crouched to meet his gaze. Who do you think I am? The boy who changed everything. Eli smiled. Maybe, but I think you'll change more. A crowd had gathered now, waiting for what they'd come for. Eli sat at the piano, alone but not. The chapel doors were open behind him. The trees rustled like a hush falling over the earth. He played, not a composition born of pain, not a storm of rebellion. This was something new. It was soft, gentle. A lullaby for the wounded boy who once tapped melodies into a windowsill. A hymn for those who believed when it was hardest. A promise to those yet to come. As the notes filled the courtyard, children swayed, teachers closed their eyes, and Tilda, standing beside her plaque, smiled. She was older now, her hair silver, but her spirit unbowed. Her hands, once rough with labor, now folded with peace. When the final note faded, Eli stood and faced the students. I was once told I didn't belong at the piano, that people like me, people without a name, or money, or a future, should stay silent. He paused, scanning their young faces. They were wrong. He stepped aside, gesturing to the piano. Now it's yours. One by one, students approached, timid at first, then bold. A girl played a few bars of a waltz. A boy followed with a jazz riff. Laughter filled the air. The piano would never be locked again. As Eli watched, he felt it rise within him. Not the ache, not the fight, but the melody that comes after the storm. A new song. and it was only just beginning. Cruelty may lock doors, but it cannot mute destiny. Eli Matthews' journey is a testament to the unstoppable force of talent when paired with truth. He lived beneath a system designed to flatten brilliance, surrounded by voices that told him to sit down, be quiet, stay small. But he listened to a louder voice, the one inside, and let it rise through his fingertips. In a world that often elevates conformity and punishes difference, Eli's story reminds us that greatness is often born in silence, cultivated in shadows, and unveiled through courage. Sometimes all it takes is one person, one Tilda, one governor, one soul who chooses to listen, to break the cycle. To the dreamers who've been told no, to the artists who've been told not you, and to the children growing up believing they're too small to be heard, let Eli be your echo. Play your song, paint your vision, speak your truth. Because the moment you dare to believe in your own music, the world will learn. It was always waiting to hear your sound.